Epidermis is made up of 4 layers in all parts of your body except for the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet, which have 5 layers. The layers start from the bottom are the stratum basal. That means the base layer. This is the only layer that's going to be dividing, actively dividing, living. Then those cells, as they divide, they're pushed up into the next layer, which is the stratum spinosum. Then they become flat and full of keratin as they move up into the next layer, which is the stratum granulosum. Only in the palms of our hands and soles of our feet do we have the next. It's a clear layer called the stratum lucidum. And the top layer is now the oldest layer because those cells have been pushed up all the way to the top, and that is the stratum corneum. And at this point, the cells are completely full of keratin, so they have become scale-like. They're completely flat. They don't even look like cells anymore. So keratin, if you remember, the cells of the epidermis are called keratinocytes, right here, keratinocytes. What they do is they produce a protein called keratin. Keratin is a very rough, tough, waterproof protein. And so that's why it makes up things like our nails and our hair, the beaks of a bird, the scales on a fish, and the same thing, the epidermis of our skin. This is our first line of defense against pathogens that are trying to get in. You have a pathogen, so something that causes disease. So let's say, here we go. We'll draw a little pathogen here. And he wants to get into our body to use our resources, right? He wants to access our iron and glucose, things like that. But what our stratum corneum does is those dead cells, they constantly flake off. So he can't ever get a grip and grow on us because as soon as he does, the cells just let go and flake off. So that is such a great line of defense. The next thing is, remember that our sebaceous glands and our sweat glands are secreting an antimicrobial property that's also blocking them. But even if he does succeed in getting in and he gets past all those defenses, we do have another cell in our epidermis that's waiting for him to catch any pathogens that get in. And that cell is kind of shaped like this. He's got long dendrites like this. He's a type of macrophage called a Langerhans cell. So this is the Langerhans cell. And what it does is any pathogens that get past our first line of defense, it's going to engulf it, and the Langerhans cell is full of lysosomes, full of enzymes that dissolve the pathogen. So anything that gets in through the first line of defense, we have something else waiting for it, the Langerhans cell. All right, so let's get back to our layers. Stratum means layer. The stratum basal, that is our base layer. So these cells are going to be dividing. These are all keratinocytes. And when they divide, they form, keratinocytes that now are going to become full of keratin. So as they become full of keratin, they get really hard and tough and rough, and they're no longer living anymore because they're getting farther away from the dermis, which is where all the vascular blood vessels are and all the oxygen. As they get farther away from the oxygen, they die, and they get full of keratin and they get hard and scaly. Also in our stratum basal, we have melanocytes. Melanocytes are making melanin. They are triggered by melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is made by the cells. So one thing that can trigger it is when the sun's UV rays. So remember, UV rays are at a higher frequency than visible light rays. So visible light rays we can see, they're at a wave, we can see. But UV rays, they move too fast for us to see. And what can happen is they can go into our cells and disrupt the DNA, and they can cause mutations. And so our cells want to make melanin to cover up the DNA so it can't get disrupted by the UV. But UV isn't all that, right? Because we also use it to make a vitamin. All right, so let's write all that. Let's go into it. So the sun's UVB rays, they come in and our cells use it to make vitamin D. Vitamin D. It's a good thing. Making vitamin D is a good thing. So we need some UV rays, but we don't want too many because too many can, remember, disrupt that DNA. So what happens is too much coming in is going to trigger these keratinocytes right here. They're going to activate a protein called P53. So P53 gets activated. That's the guardian of the genome. And it says, I don't want the DNA to get damaged. So I'm going to stimulate a melanocyte to make melanin. So what it does is it stimulates the keratinocyte to make a protein called pro-opiomelanocortin. We're going to go into it on Thursday. For right now, just know that it stimulates the melanocyte. So P53 stimulates the melanocyte to start making melanin. Melanin is a pigment, and it travels up the dendrites of the melanocyte, and it's going to go in to all these keratinocytes, these skin cells, and it's going to cover up the DNA like a blanket so that the UVB rays can't get in and mutate it. So the more melanin in someone's skin, the darker it is, and the more protected the DNA is from the UV rays. However, that means that they're going to need more sun in order to make vitamin D. It's a balance, right? So that's why people that live and evolved at much hot northern latitudes, they have less sunlight during the day. And so they need to maximize the amount of sunlight to make vitamin D, so their melanocytes aren't going to make as much melanin. Whereas people that evolved closer to the equator, they have a ton of sun. That's not the problem. There's a ton of sun. In fact, there's so much sun, they're making enough vitamin D, they got to protect themselves from DNA damage. So they're going to have melanocytes that make more melanin, and so they're going to have evolved darker skin so that they don't get DNA damage. Also in the stratum basal, there are Merkel cells. So a Merkel cell is a sensory neuron. When the shape changes, the shape change triggers the firing of the neuron afferently to tell the brain, hey, someone's touching us. A light, non-moving touch is a Merkel cell. You can remember that because Merkel sounds like murky water, which is not moving. And a melanocyte would be efferent because its effect is making something. It has an effect. All right, so moving up into the, or actually before we move up, one more thing. This is the epidermis, right? It's got keratinocytes. Below it is the dermis. Remember, we learned about the dermis already. So down here is the dermis, and it is full of cells called fibroblasts, connective tissue. It's a different tissue. It's a different type of cell. So what is connecting that? The cell adhesion molecule connecting that is half in one type of tissue, our epithelial tissue, and half in connective tissue. So it's going to be connected with a hemidesmosome. So right here, connecting the epidermis to the dermis is a cell adhesion molecule, or CAM, called a hemidesmosome. Hemi means half, so it's half one tissue, half another. So it's connecting the epidermis to the dermis. Okay, now let's talk about another CAM, and let's move up to our next layer. So the next oldest layer above stratum basal is the stratum spinosum, and that one, the cells are connected with a cell adhesion molecule that holds it together. And as this forms, it holds it together in a sheet. So that's super helpful. It's going to help prevent abrasion and damage. And it's also why when your skin peels, like a blister or after a burn, it peels off in a sheet because those cells in this layer are connected with these desmosomes. These are called desmosomes, Desmosome. And when they looked at this under a microscope, they thought that it looked spiny, and so they called it the stratum spinosum, spiny spinosum. All right, moving up, so they're starting to make keratin, and they're starting to flatten out. The granulosum is because it's full of these granules of keratin, which is making them rough, tough, and waterproof, but it's also causing them to start flatten out and look scale-like. Stratum lucidum. Lucidum in Latin means luminous. This is a clear layer. It's only in the palms of the hands, soles of the feet, and that is going to be an added layer of protection for those areas that get a lot of impact and use. And finally, the topmost layer is the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is going to have a lot of tight junctions in it. So that's another cell adhesion molecule. Tight junctions, they're connected really close together. You have them in these layers too. And what they do, they're so tight, they're holding the cells so tightly together that nothing, not even water, can permeate it. It's impermeable. It holds it tight. Now, there's one more type of cell adhesion molecule that we haven't put yet, and that is a gap junction. A gap junction creates a channel between two cells so that ions can freely move. And why would a cell want that? The whole point of a cell membrane is to tightly regulate what can come in and out of the cell. Well, there's certain parts of the body that do want gap junctions. The skin, also some in the heart. In the skin, it plays a role in these keratinocytes basically maturing. We're not exactly sure, they're not exactly sure how, but they know they're there. So these gap junctions, it creates a channel so that the ions can freely move between them. And so that's going to allow communication differentiation. Who knows? Maybe it's so that all of them in the sheet can differentiate and mature together to allow communication, cross communication. And what I told you guys is that it looks like two cells kissing, but it would be the type of kissing where they're swapping fluids. So we know what that is. That is a gap junction. So our four cell adhesion molecules are tight junction, waterproof, hemidesmosome, half one tissue, half another. Desmosome is connecting the same cells together in a sheet, and a gap junction is allowing a channel for the free movement of molecules across it. There is, let's see, there are a couple types of disorders that you need to know. Sorry, I'm looking on my cheat sheet here. We talked about different types of cancer. So remember, if it ends in oma, then it's cancer, it's malignant, is cancer. Benign, not cancer. If it's a cancer that's affecting this stratum basal, that's basal cell carcinoma, named after the stratum that it is affecting. If it is a cancer of the stratum spinosum, then that is squamous cell carcinoma. You also have melanoma, and that is affecting the melanocyte. So melanoma, melanocyte. There are autoimmune diseases also that we talked about. The autoimmune disease that attacks a melanocyte is called vitiligo. And so they're going to have patches where they produce skin with no pigmentation. We also talked about an autoimmune disease that attacks the epithelial cells, and that is going to be psoriasis, and that arises and it really flares up when a patient is under stress, infection, or cold weather. It's going to cause that to flare up. They get a rash and it thickens skin. It's very painful. Freckles are clusters of melanocytes, and I think that's it. Cyanosis, is where the skin turns blue. That's due to a lack of oxygen. Jaundice is where the skin turns yellow due to a buildup of a protein that the liver is supposed to break down, but if there's liver dysfunction, then this protein builds up, and it's a yellow protein. It's called bilirubin. It builds up, and it builds up in the skin. It also turns the whites of the eyes white. Albinism, that is a mutation in a melanocyte so that they don't produce melanin, and so there's no pigmentation in the skin. And okay, I think that's it. You guys are gonna do awesome.